They awoke to a beautiful, clear dawn and a fine view. Their ships had run aground in the natural harbor, safely away from the wild open sea. Behind the harbor was a stretch of rich grassland with luxuriant woods beyond. The place seemed to have everything they needed. Huge bunches of grapes grew on wild vines, and a spring of fresh water ran down into the harbor. Looking up at the wooded hills, Odysseus saw a herd of wild goats leaping from rock to rock. "The gods must have brought us here," he said. He and his men took their bow and spears and went off to hunt the goats. In a very short time they had enough meat to last for days, and they discovered that the island was uninhabited. At last it was safe to rest and relax. They feasted on roasted meat, washed down with wine they looted from the seacones. Afterward they lay on the beach, gazing across the mainland. They heard the sound of voices drifting over the water and bleating of sheep and goats. The evening sky from fires like theirs. Idly, as the sun went down, they wondered what kind of people lived over there. They peered across at the dark shore, but no human figures were visible. And, however hard they tried, they couldn't make out what the voices were saying. Still listening, the sailors fell asleep, one by one, beside the embers of their fires. Only Odysseus stayed awake, looking across the water. As the sky grew black and the stars came out, he stared at the glimmering light of the distant fires. Who was over there? Whose voices could they hear? As the sun rose, Odysseus was on his feet, giving orders to his men as they awoke. 11 ships must stay here to take on food and fresh water, he said. But I'll take my ship over to the mainland to see what sort of people live there. He signaled to his crew, and they followed him into the water. Clambering on board their ship, they took up their oars. It wasn't worth raising the sail, so they rowed the short distance to the opposite shore. Because they were rowing, they were facing backward. It was only when they turned the ship ready to anchor that they had their first close look at the place where they were going to land. It was a strange, unsettling sight. A little way back from the shore they saw the entrance to a vast cave, shadowed by laurel bushes. In front of the cave was a huge sheep pen, made of great blocks of rough-cut stone. Every block was taller than a man. What kind of creature could build like that? The sailors glanced nervously at one another, and someone muttered that they ought to row straight back to the island. But Odysseus was curious. He bit his lip thoughtfully, making a plan. "Most of you must stay and guard the ship," he said. "I'll take 12 men with me to explore the cave." He chose 12 of the best and bravest and ordered them to pack up some food. Then he filled a big wineskin with rich, strong wine and jumped into the water to wade ashore. He and his 12 companions crept up the beach toward the towering sheep pen. Peering through a crack in the wall, they saw it was full of lambs, but there were no adult sheep. Odysseus guessed that the main flock was up in the high pastures with their shepherd, whatever he was. That gave them a chance to explore the cave. Odysseus crept cautiously up to the entrance, beckoning his men to follow. Inside, they saw an amazing sight. The cave was very high and deep, and it was full of gigantic baskets and bowls. The baskets were filled with cheeses the size of cartwheels, and the bowls were brimming with milk and whey. "Look at all this food!" cried one of the sailors. "There are enough cheeses and lambs to last us all the way back to Ithaca." "We don't need to come as looters," Odysseus said. "I've brought gifts for the owner of this cave. He'll give us gifts in return out of politeness, and then we'll have all the meat and cheese we need. And we'll have made a new friend, not an enemy." His men were still nervous, but he persuaded them to stay. Taking dry wood from a sack at the back of the cave, they built themselves a fire and settled down to wait for the owner to return. They heard him before they saw him. Thud, thud, thud. His footsteps shook the ground ahead of him. In 3 strides he had reached the cave, and he was driving his sheep inside. A huge bundle of firewood flew in after them, and then came the giant himself. His massive body blocked out the light as he stooped to walk through the entrance. When Odysseus and his men saw that vast dark shape, they rushed to the back of the cave to hide in the shadows. By the time they turned around to take another look, the monster was blocking the entrance of the cave with a great slab of stone. They were trapped. Shivering in their corner, they watched him sniff at the dying embers of their fire. His massive head turned left and right, peering around. Then he heaped more wood onto the fire. The flame shot up, and they saw his face for the first time. It was broad and ugly, with a jutting nose and a thick, heavy jaw. In the center of his forehead was a single, hideous eye, his only one. They were trapped in the cave of a Cyclops. Sheep, guzzling down the first bucketful in a single gulp. He set the rest of the milk aside to curdle for making cheese, and then he built up the fire again, piling the wood so high that the red glare lit up the cave. This time he looked around more carefully, searching for intruders. When he saw Odysseus and his men, he bellowed, "Sheep stealers!" "We're not thieves," Odysseus said, stepping forward boldly. "We're Greek soldiers, sailing home from the war in Troy." The Cyclops peered suspiciously at him. "Sailing? Where's your ship, then?" Odysseus certainly wasn't going to tell him that. He made a sad face and gazed up at the giant. "Our ship was wrecked," he said. "Poseidon, the earth shaker, whipped up a great storm and swamped it, and we were the only men who didn't drown. Please give us food and shelter." The Cyclops laughed scornfully. Instead of answering, he reached out and grabbed two of Odysseus's men. Cramming them into his mouth, he gulped them down, grinning as the other sailors shouted in horror. Then he guzzled another bucketful of milk and sprawled on the floor, falling asleep immediately. His body was like a mountain, filling half the cave. As soon as he began to snore, Odysseus darted forward, ready to draw his sword. "I can climb up his arm," he thought, "and stab him while he's asleep." The sword was halfway out of its scabbard before he realized how stupid he would be to use it. If he killed the Cyclops, who would let them out of the cave? He and all his men working together would never be able to move the stone that blocked the entrance. Only the Cyclops was strong enough for that. Without him, they would be trapped in the cave forever, doomed to a slow death by starvation. They had to escape. If they didn't, the Cyclops would eat them all. But they couldn't get out of the cave without his help. How could they trick him into doing that? All night, Odysseus lay awake and thought, working out one plan after another. By morning, he knew what he was going to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. The Cyclops had no intention of setting them free. When he awoke, he snatched two more of the men and ate them for breakfast. Then he rolled the stone away and drove his sheep out of the cave. But he kept a constant watch on Odysseus and his companions to stop them from sneaking out with the sheep. As soon as the whole flock was outside, he followed, grinning cruelly as he pushed the stone back into place. Odysseus waited until the thunderous footsteps had died away in the distance. Then he took a long pole that was leaning against the wall of the cave. "This is the weapon we're going to use to defeat Cyclops," he said. As he explained the plan to his companions, he used the sword to cut a long piece of the pole. He sharpened it to a point and held the sharpened end in the fire to harden it. Then he hid the finished weapon at the back of the cave, ready for when the Cyclops returned. It was evening before they heard his terrible feet coming back. Thud, thud, thud. The stone was dragged away from the mouth of the cave, and in came the sheep. The Cyclops lumbered after them, pulling the stone into place behind him. The evening went the same way as the one before. The Cyclops milked his sheep and swilled down 2 bucketfuls of milk. Then he grabbed 2 sailors for his supper, crunching their bones as he chewed them up. It was a horrific sight, but Odysseus and the rest of his companions forced themselves to stay quiet. Soon they would have their revenge. When the Cyclops had finished eating, he settled himself down beside the fire. That was the moment Odysseus had been waiting for. Filling a drinking bowl with the strong wine he'd bought from the ship, he stepped forward and held it up to the Cyclops. "I bought this as a gift," he said, "hoping for your help, but I can see that you're too wild and savage to appreciate good wine." The Cyclops snatched the bowl out of his hand and drank the wine in one single gulp. Then he rolled his single glaring eye and held out the bowl. "More," he growled, "and when you've poured it, tell me your name. I have a gift for you too." Odysseus nodded and smiled, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He just filled the bowl again, and then again after that, and again. Cyclops went on guzzling the wine, not realizing how strong it was. Gradually, his speech slurred and his eye glazed over. When he was totally drunk, Odysseus spoke at last. "You asked for my name," he said. "I'll tell you. I'm called No Bodhi. Now where's the gift you promised me?" The Cyclops rolled his eyes and bellowed with laughter. Here it is. I promise to eat all your companions before I eat you. Isn't that a fine gift? I'll save you until last. He roared with laughter again and then slumped over onto his back. In less than a minute, he was snoring drunkenly. As soon as he was unconscious, Odysseus ran to the back of the cave to fetch the pole he had sharpened. Once again, he and his men plunged it into the fire, but this time they held it in there until it was red hot. When it was just about to burst into flames, they lifted it out and raised it high in the air. Then they drove it with all their strength into the Cyclops' one enormous eye, knocking them out of the way as he jumped to his feet. He went on screaming as he struggled to pull the stake out of his eye. The noise awoke every other Cyclops on the hill, and they all came racing down from their homes, shaking the ground like an earthquake. "What's the matter, Polyphemus?" they yelled. "Why are you shouting like that? Who is in the cave with you?" "Nobody!" Polyphemus shouted. "Nobody's here!" The other giants were baffled. "Has someone hurt you?" they yelled. "Do you want revenge?" "Nobody has hurt me!" Polyphemus bellowed. "I want revenge on nobody!" "Then why are you making such a fuss?" the others shouted angrily. "Be quiet and let us go to sleep." They stomped away up the hill, leaving Polyphemus blundering around the cave in agony. The worse the pain grew, the more he wanted revenge. When the morning came, he rolled the stone away from the mouth of the cave to let the sheep go out to the pasture. But he was determined not to let his enemies escape. Sitting down in the entrance, he stretched out his great arms, running them over the ground to make sure that only sheep got past him.